Hello and welcome to this Safe Work New South Wales webinar. The subject of this session is crystalline silica, and this is one in a series of webinars specifically designed to help construction site supervisors to understand the importance of their roles and the major impact they have in maintaining safe and productive work sites. My name is Gary Colthorpe and I'm a Senior Inspector with Safe Work, and I'll be co-presenting this session with State Inspector Michael Weller. Thanks for joining us today, Michael.
Thanks, Gary. It's great to be here.
It certainly is, and Michael and I will alternate between us as we take you through this presentation today. So, our inspectors see the significance and importance of your roles whenever we step onto a building or construction site. Wouldn't you agree, Michael?
We certainly do, Gary. We can often tell from the moment we walk onto the site just how serious the site supervisor is about maintaining WHS standards.
That's exactly right. And we're really hoping that by the end of this webinar, you'll have a real appreciation of your responsibilities and the influence that you have in maintaining standards, particularly in relation to crystalline silica. So let's make a start by looking at the topics we're going to cover in this webinar. Firstly, let's look at how workers encounter crystalline silica in the workplace. Then we'll consider how crystalline silica can harm workers, what to do to protect yourself and your workers from exposure to silica in the workplace, and then discuss what you're required to do by law in relation to protecting workers from exposure to silica in the workplace, the requirements for health monitoring and notification, as well as taking a look at health screening services that are available. So Michael will now take us through how workers encounter silica in the workplace and how it can cause harm. Thanks, Michael.
We need to keep in mind that crystalline silica is a very common mineral used in building products and construction materials. Some of the more common materials and products that contain crystalline silica include sandstone, concrete, bricks, tiles, and engineered stone. And some construction materials can contain up to 90% silica. In fact, most sand is basically made up of crystalline silica, or another name is quartz. Engineered materials containing silica, such as composite or engineered stone, are commonly used to fabricate kitchen benches and countertops. Workers can also come across crystalline silica when undertaking construction works that require excavation or tunnelling through quartz-containing rocks, such as shale and sandstone. Exposure can also occur through dry sweeping or using compressed air for cleaning up sites, rather than using wet cleaning techniques or using a Class M or H vacuum, and due to the resuspension of settled dust from clothing or fabric materials. Breathing in silica dust can lead to serious and fatal lung disease. Crystalline silica becomes an issue when there is uncontrolled cutting, sanding, grinding, polishing or drilling of products or materials containing crystalline silica, and hazardous levels of airborne dust are generated. Fine crystalline silica dust can also be generated when carrying out demolition and excavation work. So, how can crystalline silica harm workers in the workplace? Well, a health hazard is created when the very fine particles of crystalline silica can be inhaled. Some dust particles can be so small that they're not visible to the naked eye. These are commonly referred to as respirable particles. A respirable particle is less than about 7 microns in size, compared to a single strand of hair that is at least 60 microns in diameter. Respirable silica dust particles are small enough to penetrate deep into the lungs and can cause irreversible lung damage, including silicosis, which is a scarring of the lung. It's irreversible and in severe cases can be terminal or require a lung transplant. Lung cancer, kidney disease, and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or COPD. Factors such as how much dust a worker breathes in and for how long have an impact on the diagnosis. The scarring and fibrosis of the lungs may progress after exposure is stopped. Advanced silicosis sufferers can experience severe shortness of breath and may suffer complications such as heart failure. Silicosis is categorised into various types depending on the exposure time and concentration levels. Chronic or classic silicosis is typically observed in workers following 10 or more years of exposure. Accelerated silicosis can appear in workers after high exposure levels over a shorter period of time, usually from 1 to 10 years. Acute silicosis, which is very rare, is observed in workers usually less than 1 year after exposure to silica dust at very high levels. Gary and I will now run through how to protect yourself and your workers from exposure to silica dust, and also look at what the legislation says about this. Thanks, Gary.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Yeah, let's now look at the measures you need to take to protect yourself and the workers in the workplace from exposure to silica dust. To do that, let's consider Clause 35 of the regulations, which says that a duty holder must eliminate risks so far as reasonably practicable. And if it's not reasonably practicable to eliminate the risks, then to minimise them so far as is reasonably practicable. And Clause 36 refers to the hierarchy of controls and confirms that it applies when it's not practicable to eliminate risks, in which case a duty holder must then implement risk control measures to minimise risks by doing one or more of the following: substitution or isolation of the hazard by isolating areas where the dust is generated in the workplace from other workers, for example, or using one or more engineering controls, such as wet suppression systems to reduce the generation of dust while cutting material such as bricks or concrete, for example, or local exhaust and ventilation systems to capture and remove any potential dust, and ensuring that these systems are operating effectively and are at the correct flow rates. Dust capture systems on tools to capture dust generated by using the tool, and implementing administrative controls, such as safe work procedures, including minimising the time that workers perform high exposure tasks, and providing appropriate information, training and supervision, and ensuring the use of appropriate personal protection equipment, such as correct fitting respirators that are regularly maintained. It also notes that a combination of these controls may be used to minimise risks if a single control isn't sufficient for the purpose. And as we mentioned, taking care not to use compressed air or to allow dry sweeping where it could result in a resuspension of settled dust, and implementing controls in accordance with the product safety data sheets and product label instructions. The work health safety regulations require manufacturers and importers to provide product labels and safety data sheets to alert users to the hazards associated with using their products. Now, each of these measures we've mentioned will assist in reducing exposure to harmful silica dust in the workplace. And when considering silica dust cleanup, the following needs to be taken into account. Cleaning the workplace properly and disposing of silica-contaminated material correctly are also important for minimising exposure to silica dust for workers and others in the vicinity of the workplace. Good housekeeping practices include implementing daily cleaning procedures for settled dust and wet slurry to prevent it becoming airborne, ensuring workers wear RPE and follow good housekeeping practices when cleaning to reduce the risk of exposure to silica dust or contaminated water mist. Using low pressure water wet sweeping procedures or Class M and H vacuum cleaners to clean tools, equipment, working surfaces and PPE. And again, prohibiting dry sweeping or the use of compressed air to clean surfaces or clothing. Ensuring all waste products are disposed of in a manner that minimises the risk of dust being redistributed over the workplace. Providing workers with access to an area to wash their arms, hands and face, and providing a low pressure hose or tray of water for cleaning the bottom of footwear to prevent the spread of dust. Providing a laundry service for dusty work clothes and PPE so they're not taking home for washing. Or preventing workers' clothes being too dusty in the first place. If a commercial laundry is used, dampen the clothes and place them in a sealed, labelled plastic bag and inform the laundry that the clothes are contaminated with crystalline silica.
Good housekeeping also includes requiring workers to change dusty clothing after each shift, capturing wet slurry through graded floors, floor grates, curbing or channeling, and covering slurry, keeping it wet and bagging it before disposal. When working outdoors, the ground can be covered with plastic sheeting and remaining dust can be removed using these same methods. More information about managing facilities at the workplace can be found in the Code of Practice, Managing the Work Environment and Facilities. When disposing of contaminated material, also keep in mind that containers of hazardous waste generated at a workplace need to be labelled appropriately, including silica dust, which should be labelled as silica dust hazard or similar. Waste contaminated by silica dust can include any disposable clothing or PPE, rags used to clean the work area, or tools or equipment that cannot be cleaned or are no longer required. Bags used for containing waste need to be strong enough to ensure they will not tear and release dust, and should not be more than half filled, and have excess air evacuated from the bag in a way that does not cause the release of dust. A waste management system needs to be in place that eliminates the risk of silica dust being released and becoming airborne. Now, we'll take a look at what you're required to do by law, but before we go through these next slides, we have a bit of a disclaimer. This is where we'll talk about some key clauses in the legislation, and we're just going to mention the highlights and summarise rather than quote the law word for word. This is not legal advice. We're just trying to help you understand a number of the key responsibilities that you need to be aware of in your role as a supervisor. To review all of your legal responsibilities and the full details on these requirements, you need to look up the WHS Act 2011 and the WHS Regulations 2017, which are both available online. Section 19 of the WHS Act refers to the primary duty of care and says that a person conducting a business or undertaking, who we often refer to as a PCBU, and we can generally think of as an employer or business owner, must ensure, so far as is reasonably practicable, the health and safety of workers while at work in the business and the provision and maintenance of a work environment that is without risk to health and safety, safe plant and structures, safe systems of work, the safe use, handling and storage of plant, structures and substances, adequate facilities, information, training, instruction or supervision, and that the health of workers and the conditions at the workplace are monitored for the purpose of preventing illness or injury of workers. So we can see that a PCBU has significant responsibilities when it comes to ensuring that the workplace is without risks to health and safety, including in relation to the risk of breathing in respirable crystalline silica dust. And Section 16 of the WHS Act tells us that more than one person can have the same duty at the same time, and each duty holder must comply with that duty, even if another person has the same duty. And that if more than one person has the same duty, each person retains responsibility for it and must discharge it to the extent that they have the capacity to influence and control it. There can be multiple duty holders on a construction site, such as the principal contractor, the project manager, site supervisor, site foreman, and the subcontractors' supervisors. And although roles and job descriptions for supervisors may differ from site to site in relation to the tasks they perform, every supervisor has responsibilities when it comes to work health and safety because of their ability to influence and control it in the workplace. So what does this mean for you as a construction site supervisor? It means that if you have the capacity to influence and control health and safety on site, then you also have the legal duty to do so, irrespective of whether someone else has the same duty. If you're in a position to influence and control health and safety in relation to the risk of breathing in respirable particles of crystalline silica dust in the workplace, then you have a responsibility to do so. No one in a supervisory role on a worksite should ever say that it's someone else's responsibility to manage health and safety if they have the capacity to influence and control the situation. Workers also have responsibilities and a legal duty to take reasonable care of their own health and safety and take care that their acts and omissions do not adversely reflect the health and safety of others, as well as cooperate with any reasonable policy or procedure of the PCBU relating to health and safety at the workplace. And so workers should not be carrying out any work that involves uncontrolled cutting, sanding, grinding, polishing or drilling of products or materials containing crystalline silica that will create hazardous levels of airborne dust. Gary will now take us through a number of other key clauses of the WHS regulations that you need to be aware of when managing silica dust exposure in the workplace. Thanks, Gary.
Thanks, Michael. Yes, you need to be aware of these other key clauses when considering the requirements for managing exposure to crystalline silica in the workplace, including Clause 39, which says that a PCBU must ensure that information, training and instruction is provided to workers and is both suitable and adequate, having regard to the nature of the work to be carried out, the nature of the risks associated with the work, the control measures implemented, and ensuring that it's readily understandable by the person it is provided to. Clause 49 also says, a PCBU must ensure that no person at the workplace is exposed to a substance or mixture in an airborne concentration that exceeds the exposure standards for the substance or mixture. And Clause 50 says, a PCBU must ensure that air monitoring is carried out if, uncertain whether or not an airborne concentration of substance at the workplace exceeds the exposure standard, or monitoring is necessary to determine whether there is a health risk. And confirms that the results of air monitoring must be recorded and kept for 30 years and readily accessible to anyone at the workplace who may be exposed to the substance. Safe Work Australia publishes the Workplace Exposure Standards for Airborne Contaminants and other guidance material which are available online. It's the responsibility of the supplier, manufacturer and importer, however, to determine whether their product is a hazardous chemical, and if so, to correctly classify their product. But if you're unsure about the classification of a chemical, you should contact the supplier, manufacturer or importer for more information or source independent professional advice. Clause 1840 says a PCBU must not direct or allow a worker to cut, grind, drill or polish manufactured stone containing crystalline silica with a power tool unless each worker who may inhale dust is wearing a respiratory protective equipment that protects the worker from the inhalation of dust and complies with the Australian New Zealand standard for respiratory protective devices. And one or more of the following controls is in place, which are properly designed, installed, used and maintained to effectively reduce exposure to the dust. A water delivery system that supplies a continuous feed of water over the area being cut. An extraction system that is attached to the tool being used. Or a local exhaust ventilation system that captures the dust and transports it to a safe emission point or filter. Michael will now take us through the requirements for health monitoring and notification. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, Gary. Yes, let's now look at Clause 368 to 378 of the WHS regulations, which detail the requirements for health monitoring and when notification to Safe Work is necessary. You definitely need to be aware of these requirements for health monitoring if workers are exposed to hazardous chemicals such as silica in the workplace. Clause 368 says that a PCBU must ensure that health monitoring is provided to a worker carrying out work with hazardous chemicals and there is a significant risk to the worker's health as a result. Schedule 14 of the regulations confirms that crystalline silica is considered to be a hazardous chemical that requires health monitoring. Clause 369 says that a PCBU who is required to provide health monitoring for a worker must give information about the health monitoring to the worker. Clause 370 says that a PCBU must ensure that health monitoring includes the type required. Clause 371 says that a PCBU must ensure that the health monitoring is carried out by or under the supervision of a registered medical practitioner with experience in health monitoring. And Clause 372 says a PCBU must pay all expenses relating to the health monitoring required. Clause 373 of the regulations provides details about the information that must be provided to a registered medical practitioner conducting the health monitoring, including the work that the worker is or will be carrying out that has triggered the requirement for the health monitoring, and if the worker has started that work, how long the worker has been carrying out that work. Clause 374 details the duty to obtain the health monitoring report and confirms that this must occur as soon as possible after the monitoring is carried out. And Clause 375 relates to the PCB's duty to give the health monitoring report to the worker as soon as possible after obtaining it as well. Clause 376 says a PCBU must give a copy of the report to the regulator, in this case being Safe Work New South Wales, as soon as possible after obtaining the report. If the report contains either of advice that the worker may have contracted a disease, injury or illness as a result of carrying out the work with hazardous chemicals, or any recommendation that the PCBU undertake remedial measures, including whether the worker can continue to work with the hazardous chemicals, in this case being silica. Clause 377 says the person who commissioned health monitoring for a worker must give a copy of the report to all other PCBUs who have a duty to provide health monitoring for the worker as soon as possible after obtaining the report. And Clause 378 says a PCBU must ensure that health monitoring reports are kept as confidential records for at least 30 years after the record is made. There are numerous alternatives for where to have worker health monitoring undertaken. Insurance and Care New South Wales, that is iCare, offers one alternative with health monitoring and lung screening services, including through their mobile lung screening testing services, which is available to visit work sites or premises across New South Wales. Employers can choose the right service option depending on the location and size of their workforce. And workers can also find out if their diagnosis has been notified by calling Safe Work New South Wales on 13 10 50. Gary will now discuss the guidance materials available and how best to get in touch with Safe Work New South Wales. Thanks, Gary.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, there is a large volume of guidance material available through Safe Work New South Wales, some of which are shown on this slide. Visit the Safe Work New South Wales website and type crystalline silica into the search bar to access instructive videos, fact sheets and guidance material, all designed to help you to understand your obligations for managing silica safety in the workplace. We really encourage you to access and read through this information. As well as watching the other webinars in this supervisor series, we'd like to recommend listening to our range of short podcasts known as safety casts. These safety casts involve safe work inspectors discussing specific work health safety topics, including scaffolding, electrical safety, and working at heights, to name a few. They also contain information about other available resources. They're a modern way of engaging with industry and are convenient for listening to on demand. We would encourage you to tap into this resource as they're great for toolbox talks with short, sharp messaging and educational information on specific topics in construction. They're freely available on many media platforms, including Spotify, Apple Play, the web and other apps. Simply search for Safe Work Safety Casts in your search engine to access these latest safety casts. And our Speak Up app allows you to advise us of any unsafe workplace activity you may encounter, and you can remain anonymous. You can also download this app through the Safe Work New South Wales website. And in wrapping up this webinar, we'd like to remind you that you can also always contact us on 13 10 50 to seek advice, report a health and safety concern, or to speak to an inspector about any health and safety matter. Well, Michael, I believe that's a wrap. So thank you for joining me in this presentation today, and thank you to everyone listening today. We really hope that you found this information valuable.
Thanks, Gary. And yes, thank you for joining us today, everyone, and we hope to see you again.